The plague, when it hits Walsham in Easter, just after Easter 1349, is probably its most extensive.
That was John Hatcher, on location in a village that was ravaged by the Black Death.
Sir Hugh Willoughby wrote in his log, which was recovered afterwards, that the land lay not as the globe made mention, because he was working with a globe which simply bore no relation to the land as he saw it.
And that was James Evans on a tale of 16th century exploration. Hello and welcome to the History Extra podcast. My name is Rob Attar and I'm the editor of BBC History magazine, which is the UK's best-selling history magazine. You can find it in all good newsagents, or you can take out a subscription from anywhere in the world. See historyextra.com/subscribe-today for subscription deals. We also have digital editions available for the iPad, the Kindle Fire, Google Play and Zinio. And for those of you with a Kindle Fire, I should mention that that edition is now available in the United States as well. For details of all of these, head to historyextra.com/digital. Now at the moment we're running a very special Christmas offer where you can purchase any digital edition of the magazine for just 99p or the equivalent in your currency on the iPad, the Kindle Fire or Google Play. Look out for BBC History magazine at the newsstand or App Store to take advantage of this deal, which begins tomorrow and runs until the 1st of January. So this is our last podcast of 2013. I hope you all had a good Christmas and are in the mood for some fascinating slices of history to accompany your turkey sandwiches. First up this week, we're heading to the Suffolk village of Walsham-le-Willows, which lost half its population to the Black Death in the 14th century. Our features editor, Charlotte Hodgman, joined Professor John Hatcher at Walsham-le-Willows to explore how this terrible disease shaped the village and the wider country as well.
Right, so we're looking at the court roll for Walsham-le-Willows for the 15th of June 1349. We're going to talk about that, but what actually the information contained. But can you just tell us what actually was a court roll? What's it telling us?
Well, each Lord Lady of the Manor would hold a court which would be used to administer the manor that they owned, and really had two sets of business. One which is the Lord or Lady of the Manor enforcing their rights to collect fines, to discipline people and maintain order and secure their income. And the other aspect of it is the community itself needing to regulate farming, so make sure that people keep their animals under control, don't let them trespass. Also advantage for the peasants themselves of having a record of their holdings of land and their obligations and so on. So, and these courts are held during the year, on average about once a month, I think, across the country, but it varies from area to area, sometimes held more frequently if there's a lot of business. And they exist in very large numbers all across the country, from manor after manor, so there's literally thousands of them in existence still.
So it really was just a record of that, what was going on at that session.
Yes.
And you've selected this role to look at in particular. Why? What's so special about this one?
Well, it's the size of it. It records, it's the first court to be held after the arrival of the Black Death in Walsham. The village of Walsham has there are three manors in it, one very small, but two manors have left court records. Okay. So the great advantage of Walsham over other villages for the history of the Black Death being recorded is that both of these courts have continuous records not only right through the period of the Black Death, but actually for a few years before the Black Death and a year or so afterwards, complete records, which means we can date the arrival of the Black Death very precisely, and also when it left the village. And this court is for the manor of Walsham. The other manor in the village is High Hall, the manor of Walsham, and it's the first court held after the plague has struck, and it lists 103 deaths occurring among the tenants of the manor.
Do we know in what period of time that would have been? So when was the court before then?
The court before then is the 6th of March, 1349, and there are no unusual deaths. I'm not even sure there's a single death. Deaths are always recorded in the court rolls, the deaths of tenants.
Okay.
So there's nothing unusual in the court of the 6th of March 1349, and we know the plague hasn't struck the village at that date. There's a court for High Hall, which is the other manor which is recorded in Walsham on the 25th of May, and that has exceptional numbers of deaths, but probably the epidemic hadn't peaked by the 25th of May, but we know that it's in the village well before the 25th of May. And then we have the 15th of June court roll, which is this one here before us of extraordinary length.
I mean, it's an astonishing document. I was just looking at it. If you sort of unravel it, it's probably over a metre, isn't it? I would say well over a metre in length.
Yes. Yeah, you can see where they sewed on an extra membrane.
Yeah.
These are the court records.
Yeah.
Which don't fill up the membrane because they write them one after the other.
Yeah.
But this single court, the clerk had to sew an extra membrane on because
just to get all those
so
extra
much
names.
business going on. And then we can date the cessation of the plague as well because of the continuousness of the records. So the next High Hall court is the 23rd of July, which has a large number of deaths because the previous court for High Hall was at the end of May, so you've got all the people who died after the end of May.
Okay.
And then there's a Walsham court of the 1st of August with only five new records of deaths. Yeah. So between the June court and the August court, only 5 people died, and possibly they didn't all die afterwards. They may have already been dead, but just didn't appear in the court.
So that's about 8 weeks then?
So it lasts 8 or 9 weeks.
That's quite surprising, because I mean, I think I've always thought, I think lots of people always thought that it could stay in a village or a town for some months before it kind of died out. Well,
in a town, it's clear it does stay longer. I think having much larger population. So in London, it's 4 or 5 months.
Yeah.
With lulls in between. It's just the size of the community, but the vast majority of the population of England are living in villages of the size of Walsham, a little bit bigger, most of them a bit smaller. So we can say that in the places that it visited, the hundreds and hundreds of villages it visits, it stayed no longer than 8, 9 weeks at most.
And yet managed to wipe out, was it half the population of that?
Well, in Walsham it's slightly over 50%, so it's more than 1 in 2 of the population in that period.
So were the families of the tenants also listed on here? So anybody in that village who had died, or who came under that manor who had died in that period would be listed on here?
No.
So these are just, so we don't know about...
No, it's a record of land holding, so that this is why it's only the tenants. The other people who are mentioned in the court associated with that death would be the heir.
Right.
So that the court records the death, it extracts what's called a heriot, which is a death duty on the estate of the person who's just died, and then the jurors of the village would have made inquiries to find out who was in line to inherit that. And we see in this court, in case after case after case, where the heirs are much more distant. Sometimes they can't find an heir, or the heir is much more distant than the normal father-to-son inheritance that you get in the relatively settled period before the Black Death. Father-son with widow being provided. And of course you then get large numbers of deaths occurring within the same family. So there's a considerable increase in the number of women inheriting, because women inherited only if there were no male heirs. So,
and do we notice that more during the period when the Black Death was there?
Absolutely.
And how usual was it for these courts to be held during this period of when the disease was sort of sweeping the country? When we've got this court being held right in the middle of, middle of it.
Yeah, the remarkable one is the court held at High Hall, actually. The Walsham court is held towards the end. I think the plague is fading rapidly by the end of June. But the Walsham, the High Hall court, which is held on the 25th of May, is close probably to the peak of the epidemic. Well, I think why it's held, the Lord of the Manor himself doesn't hold the court. He brings in a parson from a neighbouring
so he stays safe at home.
village to hold it. But I think that the lords are just terrified that they're losing control of what's going on.
Yeah.
Because in each year, even with a large manor, you might have 3 or 4 tenants dying. Everything's controlled. 100 deaths, or on a small manor like High Hall, 20 or 30 deaths. So he's desperate to secure heirs, to get people on the land paying their rents. So they hold courts. But although, again, Walsham is unusual, I think. Why there's a shortage of records for the period of the Black Death itself is firstly because the reeve, the lord, the clerk of court would die.
Right.
And therefore there was nobody to
record,
prepare the record. And then the other reason is that they didn't want to hold a court, or people wouldn't attend the court, because a lot of the medical advice at the time, a fair amount of it was quite reasonable, but very basic, which is just keep away from other people during an epidemic like this.
Right, so sitting in St Mary's Church in Walsham Le Willows now, which would be probably, I'd imagine, one of the focal points of the village at this point. What did the village look like on the eve of the Black Death before, what the population and what were people like?
Well, the population is high. There's been a long period of population growth which stretched back before the Norman conquest, possibly to the 800s, and the village had grown and was probably 2.5 times the size that it had been in the year 1000. And the majority of people in the village would have been poor. The early 14th century, some really appalling famines when the harvests fail for 3 years in succession. So it's a village that is on the edge of subsistence, although there are some richer people in the village, of course, overpopulated. And therefore the Black Death, in a cold economic sense, brings immediate prosperity to the survivors, because the population has been halved, land is more easily available, cheap, rents fall, people inherit land who'd previously been landless. The balance of power between the landlord and the population of the manor has shifted, because now workers are in demand and they're paid higher wages. So the Black Death itself, in that sense, does bring about a great improvement in the condition of the survivors, but of course bought at a very, very high price of these phenomenal death rates.
So if you survived, if you're lucky enough to survive, you found yourself in a much better position, really. I mean, well, economically speaking.
Yes. But what's often not realise, because the Black Death is so spectacular, is that the plague keeps coming back. It comes back in 1361, 62, 1369, 1375.
Right.
So it's the nature of the diseases. Once it becomes endemic, it has repeated outbreaks, and this keeps the population down for really through to the early 16th century.
And were those later outbreaks, were they as sort of devastating to the population as that first one in the...
No, but if they'd have occurred by themselves, they would have been remembered and famous, causing death rates.
Because it is that first one that we remember,
15%,
isn't it?
20% in some places, 12%. These are very high death rates, but of course the Black Death with an average across the whole of Europe in excess of 40% is just so spectacular.
And just the disease itself, do we know for certain where it came from, what it actually was? Because there's been quite a lot of debate, hasn't there, over the years?
Yeah, in this case, there's been scientific proof very recently using burial pits of the Black Death of the mid-14th century, and DNA advances in DNA enabling very robust samples to be obtained particularly from teeth, dental pulp. There's also now a rapid diagnostic test, a swab that can show up the antigens which are unique to plague, and it definitely was bubonic plague, which is what was thought in the 19th century, but over the last 30 years increasingly medical opinion has been against bubonic plague because it is really a very mechanical disease. It depends upon each victim being bitten by what was thought to be an infected flea. We now know that it was probably body lice as well, but each individual who contracts the disease has to be bitten by an insect, apart from pneumonic plague, but that is often thought not to have played a great part in the outbreak. We've got conclusive proof that it was bubonic plague, which raises all sorts of problems as to how it managed to spread so comprehensively across Europe and kill so many people, and do it in the space of 7 years.
And what do we know about the first cases in this particular village? We've already, the records for this village are very good. Do we know anything about those first people?
No, we know almost the precise date, which is just after Easter, 1349. And in fact, the plague at that time, when it's hitting Walsham, it's probably at its most extensive across Europe. The plague, when it hits Walsham in Easter, just after Easter 1349, is probably at its most extensive. It's across the whole of central England from east to west.
And what were people's reactions in this particular village? Do we know, did they turn to the church and, did people, because I know on the continent reactions were quite a lot stronger, seemed to be a lot stronger. What were the comparisons there?
Well, we don't really have the records in the village that give us that information. We can use other records. I think what happens immediately is that although faith may have been shaken and questions asked, and God viewed in different terms really as rather an angry God rather than an Abraham figure welcoming people into his bosom. But the effect of the plague, and in fact later outbreaks of plague, is to strengthen people's commitment to organised religion. They want to play a larger part in it for themselves. They demand sermons. They hire priests in parish guilds. They want a more personal religion. But the religion doesn't alter very much, and in fact it becomes rather obsessive with the afterlife, the risk of dying with a great weight of sin on one's soul, spending a long time in purgatory for these sins to be purged. So the setting up of chapels for masses to be said for the dead. So a lot of resources of the living are devoted to the church in order to say masses for the souls of one's parents, and also, of course, to prepare one for death and to leave lasting memorials in chapels that will lead, if you're rich enough, to prayers being said for your soul after your death. And it's been called by some historians as a cult of the living devoted to death. And it does become, in the eyes of a lot of church historians, too obsessive. But this, I think, is being driven by the people themselves rather than the church.
Okay. I mean, your book gives a real sense of the ceremony and the kind of around someone's death, people gathering, neighbours gathering around the bed, the priest doing the last rites and, absolving them of their sins. What happened when there were, you were saying at one point there were sort of 60 people per day at the peak, dying per day. You have one priest in this village. What did people do?
Well, there are probably more than one priest, 2 or 3, but the priests also are dying.
Yeah, of course.
And at the peak of the epidemic, or even well before then, because for everybody dying, you've got twice as many on their sick beds, asking for priests. The system collapses. It's absolutely impossible for not only good deaths, which is a very lengthy business, taking the time of the priest for an hour, maybe 2 hours, a gathering of neighbours in the ideal circumstances, which was certainly happening before the plague. But also the conducting of the funeral service, the full Christian burial, which collapses at this time. We know this from English chroniclers, but particularly Italian chroniclers, the hurried burials, the large numbers of people dying without a priest, but not only without a priest, without neighbours or without their family who have deserted them for fear of the plague. So it's an incredibly traumatic experience because, as you said, having a good death and an appropriate funeral is so vital in the passage of the soul. But the church responds as well as it can. The evidence we have suggests that priests are very diligent. But also, when the plague starts, the church becomes aware of the scale of the onslaught that it faces. The Pope, at a very early stage, permits the confession of the dying to laymen and laywomen.
Women as well, right.
In order to give some comfort to the dying.
And in terms of burial, with the church we're in today, the graveyard, we know that the village is half the population of the village died.
Yes.
So some 750 people were buried in this, but not in individual graves, I assume, at its peak.
No, I think not. The excavations that have taken of Black Death burials tend to see rather orderly burials, but the digging of very large graves and bodies laid side by side. And there's an Italian chronicler who writes in rather a bit of black humour. He says that the graves were like lasagna. You'd have a layer of meat, and then you'd put a layer of pasta, which would be the soil over the top, and then you'd have another layer of meat. He said, just like making pasta. And of course this would be essential in order to be able to bury the bodies on consecrated ground, which is so important. You can't, a full Christian burial requires consecrated ground, and the just overwhelming numbers of deaths. But they weren't too concerned in the Middle Ages about digging up the bones of people who died sometime before. So I think a lot of that is going on in order to make space for new burials. The bones are being dug up and piled against the wall of the churchyard. And as I say, in larger towns, there's a lot of evidence of chaos. I suspect in the village it was less chaotic, but in towns you do hear of bodies being dumped by the roadside, thrown out of windows, and people having to pay vast sums of money to what they term ruffians and crude folk to take their loved ones off for burial, and then they wouldn't take them to burial, but like dumping waste now. They cart them off and then tip them over a hedge into a field. And
I mean, some historians have argued that medieval chroniclers have maybe exaggerated some diseases and things like that. Do you think that's been the case with the Black Death, or do you think it really was as horrific as we think it was?
Yeah, I think if anything, the majority of the chroniclers are rather low-key, because by the time the plague arrived in the place where they were observing it, they were already aware, the way it spreads across Europe, they'd heard stories of what had happened in Constantinople or what had happened in Kaffa or places on the way. What is very interesting is that it used to be thought that the Black Death killed about 30% or a third of the population.
That's what I was always taught at school,
And that was then considered to be an exaggeration, because we know chroniclers exaggerate. And sometimes they do get their figures wildly wrong if they say 200,000 people died in Florence, when historians know that there weren't 100,000 people in Florence. But in fact, the more scientific the study of the available sources has been, the death rate has tended to be pushed up rather than down, and it's now universally accepted that the death rate was well over a third, and in fact the majority of expert opinion would place it at 40-45%.
And did villages and towns find that some people had the attitude that, well, if I'm going to die, I don't want to spend my last days working in your field, toiling away, and then sort of, was there that sort of attitude?
Yeah, I think it's best expressed, I think, in Boccaccio, who talks about human nature, how some people do all they can to avoid God's punishment by behaving as chastely and as prudently and as spiritually orthodox as possible, whereas others give up and say, well, if we're going to die, let's make the most of it.
A bit of fun before. Do you think Walsham can be seen as like a microcosm for what was going on in England as a whole?
Yes.
Is it fair to look at it like that?
I think it is. Walsham's exceptional for the quality of its records. It's not exceptional for its experience.
So it is kind of a typical...
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So the death rate varies from village to village, but broadly within the range of 25% to 75%. But the great majority of villages that we have evidence of the rate of death is of the order of 40 to 50%. So I think Walsham there'll be hundreds of villages in Wiltshire, in Somerset, in Suffolk, in Essex, which are experiencing very similar fortunes or misfortunes to Walsham.
That was Professor John Hatcher on location in Walsham-le-Willows. John has written a piece about the Black Death for our Christmas issue, which is on sale now. Also in the issue, we're discussing the Celts, Stonehenge, the Second World War Arctic convoys, Tudor animals, and much, much more. You can still get hold of a copy in all good newsagents and digitally. Before our second interview, here's a reminder of our next BBC History magazine events. On the 15th and 16th of March next year, we're holding 2-day events at Bristol's M Shed. On Saturday the 15th, it's our Vikings Day, and then on Sunday the 16th, we're holding a First World War Day. On both occasions, you'll get a chance to hear talks from a range of experts and you'll also enjoy a buffet lunch on each day. For more information and tickets, please visit historyextra.com/events, and we hope to see lots of you there. Earlier this year, a Chinese container ship arrived in Rotterdam, having travelled along the Northeast Passage, that is, traversing the northern shores of Russia to arrive in Europe. The journey time was just 35 days, as opposed to 48 for the traditional Suez Canal route. This is not, however, the first time that people have attempted this shortcut to the east. Back in 1553, 3 ships departed England, seeking to find the Northeast Passage and travel that way to Asia. Their remarkable story is told by James Evans in his recent book, Merchant Adventurers. I spoke to James a couple of weeks back to find out what happened to these brave Tudor explorers, and began by asking him how he first became interested in this story.
Well, I mean, I work in television as well as being a writer, so I was producing a big documentary series by a historian who's probably narrowly better known than me, Neil Ferguson, who was doing a series about Western civilization and basically looking at the reasons why Western civilization had been, for a time, preeminent in sense, much more successful than other regions of the world. And what he wanted to do was to draw the contrast between some voyages which set out from China in the early 15th century, led by Admiral Zheng He, and the slightly later voyages of trade and exploration which set out from Europe. And I think we were looking for one single European voyage which would make a suitable contrast. And it was then, I think, that I first read about the great English voyage of 1553, and was completely taken aback that I'd not read about it before and thought I should have done.
And so in this voyage they were looking for the Northeast Passage. And I've heard quite a bit about the Northwest Passage, but far less about the Northeast ones. Could you just explain what exactly that was, or is?
Yes, well, what they hoped was that if they travelled northeast and basically went up the western coast of Norway and rounded the top of Scandinavia, that they would sail past, as indeed they did sail past, a North Cape, a version of the cape that was rounded at the bottom of Africa, and that after that, the coastline along the top of Asia would descend gradually into much warmer climates and easier waters, and that by that route they could gradually work their way down towards China and Cathay as it was known, and these rich lands that they'd read so much about and that they desperately wanted to reach. Didn't quite work out that way, but that's what they hoped.
So in a sense they were doing similar to what people like Columbus had been trying to do in the other direction, to find a better route to the east.
Precisely. That's what they wanted to get. Where they wanted to go was China, Cathay as it was known, and the Spice Islands. They'd read huge amounts in accounts by people like Marco Polo, who'd written many years ago about the wealth that was to be found in the East. And not so long ago, Spain and Portugal had discovered great wealth by travelling both west and east. And the English were very aware that they lived on a northerly island, and if there was a passage in the north, either northwest or northeast, by which they could reach China, that it would be enormously lucrative, and that was what they tried. That was what they hoped to do, and that was what they tried to do in 1553.
So who were the people that set off on this voyage?
Well, the overall captain of the expedition was a gentleman soldier by the name of Sir Hugh Willoughby, who, he's known to have led privateering voyages in the wars against France and Scotland, but as far as is known, he didn't particularly have any expertise as a navigator. However, his second in command, his grand pilot, or his chief pilot as it was known, was a young man from Bristol called Richard Chancellor, and he, very differently, was a genuinely new, a man in an entirely new mould. He was both a sailor, a practical sailor, but he was also a mathematician. He was an astronomer. He made his own instruments. And this was the first time, really, that England had seen anyone like him be put in charge of a voyage of this kind. And all of those who came after him, Sir Francis Drake, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, and so on, the much better known people, much better known explorers, owed a huge amount to him, because it was Richard Chancellor who came first.
What were these people, obviously there was a wider goal, but what were they personally hoping to gain from this voyage?
Well, wealth, certainly. I mean, if they were able to get through to Cathay, to the Spice Islands, then, people didn't need to be told how rich people in Spain and Portugal had become through finding new lands across the ocean. They were hoping for renown as well, of course. I mean, they would go down, as they well knew, in the annals of exploration. It would be a venture which would change the history of England forever. So yes, they hoped for all of these things. And of course they hoped for, there was a genuine sense that, you read time and time again in the history of the English and then the British Empire, that England was in a sense fulfilling a divine plan, that it was meant to make its way towards, great riches, great renown in the world. And that what they were doing was simply acting on this, that there must therefore be a northern passage which was peculiarly suitable for England to reach distant lands and to reach the wealth that seemed its lot.
What kind of maps or charts did they have to guide them in their way? Did they have anything like that at all?
Well, they had maps of Europe. As soon as they started venturing north, their maps became extremely unreliable. In the course of this great exploration, the three ships were separated in a storm, and two of those ships were left floundering, not knowing exactly where they were. And Sir Hugh Willoughby wrote in his log, which was recovered afterwards, that the land lay not as the globe made mention, because he was working with a globe which simply bore no relation to the land as he saw it. And of course, he was entirely right. The land didn't lie as the globe made mention. So it was an incredibly difficult thing to do.
Looking back at it now, do you think they were insufficiently prepared for this kind of voyage?
I think they were probably as well prepared as they could have been. Enormous effort had been taken to provide, the ships with food, with everything that they could be provided for. The ships had been newly built because Sebastian Cabot rightly realised that many older ships that were used for trading in Europe had fallen into disrepair and were dangerous. One of the ships, indeed, had been lined with lead because he knew well enough, and he'd worked for a long time in Spain, where voyages were mounted which went across to the Caribbean, the damage that could be done by warm water. There was a worm called the Teredo shipworm. It wasn't actually a worm at all, but that's what it was known as. And it could eat through the woods, the timber from which ships were built, and do enormous damage. And of course, what they hoped was that they would themselves reach warm waters in the Pacific. And so one of the ships was lined with lead, as a kind of precaution against precisely this danger. As it turns out, of course, there was absolutely no reason for it to be lined with lead, because they remained in cold water. And the Teredo shipworm would have presented no threat at all. But it's an illustration of the lengths to which people went to ensure that they were well provided.
You mentioned that the ships were separated. What was the eventual fate of the people on these ships?
Well, the story became a divided one. Cabot had, Sebastian Cabot, I should say, was the man who mounted the venture and organised it, but was himself quite elderly and didn't sail on it. He'd given them very strict instructions to stay together. There were three ships, but much as you can instruct people to stay together, the elements came first, and there was a great storm off the Norwegian coast as they sailed north, which blew them apart. Sir Hugh Willoughby, who was in overall command of the venture, went one way, and the very talented young Bristol seaman Richard Chancellor, who was in charge of navigation and who was captaining another ship, went another way, while Richard Chancellor did manage to take down his mainsail and to remain in control and to navigate around the northern tip of Scandinavia just as they'd planned. Willoughby and the two other ships were blown far to the north, and they tried to work out where they were, but of course they didn't. The land, as they said, didn't lie as the globe made mention. They were in an entirely unknown region, and for weeks they crisscrossed what's now known as the Barents Sea, beset by floating ice, unexpected shallows. They explored remote islands, but they found no human life at all. And eventually they put into a river estuary on the northern shore of the Kola Peninsula. Men were sent out on long overland treks to look for help, but when they found no one, because by that time of year the Sami population had moved south. They just decided to batten the hatches and see out the winter. And it was only months later that the ships were found by Russian fishermen, who also, fortunately for us, found the log which Willoughby had kept, which allows us to recreate exactly what happened to them. Meanwhile, Richard Chancellor piloted his ship into the White Sea, where they anchored near to where Archangel now is. Local Russian communities sent word of their arrival to the ruler in distant Moscow, Tsar Ivan IV, who was later known, of course, as Ivan the Terrible. Chancellor and his leading merchants travelled by sled across hundreds of miles of Russian wilderness to visit the Russian capital, which then was entirely unknown to the English. They were welcomed. They were treated to a great feast with roast swan and vast quantities of alcohol. The contact Chancellor made led to the foundation of the first great English trading company, known as the Muscovy Company, which acted as a model for many which came afterwards, most famously, of course, the East India Company.
So Richard Chancellor, he made it to Russia, and I presume he made it back alive. But nobody at all then, Hugh Willoughby's ship did survive.
They didn't know. They were found in the following spring by a small party of Russian fishermen, but all of the men on board had died.
Do you see him in some ways as a bit of a Captain Scott figure?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt at all that the voyage was one of triumph and disaster, and it's easy to be critical of him because he wasn't a man like Richard Chancellor. He wasn't a man who understood the new sciences of exploration and navigation on the seas. He wasn't a man who understood mathematics or astronomy. But at the same time, the vast majority of people who led voyages at sea in England at the time didn't. He was entirely typical of those who did. It was Richard Chancellor who was the exception. But for that very reason, it's Richard Chancellor who should be known much better than he is.
Even despite Richard Chancellor's successes, they didn't find the North East Passage. Did anybody then find it later on?
They kept looking. There was a man who sailed with Richard Chancellor called Stephen Burrough, who sailed again a few years later, but no, he didn't. The simple fact is that in the 16th century there wasn't a North East Passage to find. There was too much ice. The conditions were just too difficult. There simply wasn't a way through, and it wasn't actually until the 19th century that anyone succeeded in sailing through the North East Passage. It's actually rather an interesting story because very recently, literally in the last month or so, a Chinese container ship has succeeded in sailing through the North East Passage, the other direction, of course, which tells its own story. And, climate scientists today debate how long it'll be before the North East Passage is an entirely viable route. And when it is, it genuinely will transform the pattern of global trade because it is quicker. I mean, I think it takes about 2 weeks off the southern route, which is currently taken from China to Europe. So, it will be a very important moment. But the fact is that the Chinese container ship, which recently sailed, had to sail in the company of an icebreaker. It isn't at the moment quite a viable route, but people think it will be, and when it is, it will be a big moment.
What do you see as the main legacy of the 1553 voyage?
Well, I mean, it was a success in the sense that Richard Chancellor did reach Russia. The trade to Russia was pursued for many decades. There were items like train oil, that is oil from seal blubber, tallow, rope, all of which were shipped for sale in England over a long period of time. The business wasn't vastly profitable, in part because Russia under Ivan the Terrible became a very dangerous and unstable place, but its long-term influence was incalculable, there's no doubt. From an economic point of view, the Muscovy Company was a joint stock company in which investors could put up money, hoping to make a very substantial return without taking any active part in the business. Such an enterprise had never been mounted in England before, but they often were afterwards, and future trading ventures, including the East India Company, were organised along the same lines. It was also a period when a curiosity to learn about the world in a way which sounds modern, almost scientific, had come to the fore for the first time. And in the writing of men like Sebastian Cabot and Richard Chancellor, one can hear it very clearly. Learning about geography was perhaps peculiarly a very empirical pursuit. It was no coincidence that here, perhaps first of all, the authority of the ancient writers was questioned and cast off. They had said men could not pass through the equatorial regions, for instance, because of the extreme heat. But it wasn't true. They had not known about America. The simple fact was that if men wanted to discover, they realized that they had to go out and look for themselves. I think this was the new ethos which drove the 1553 voyage, and its importance scarcely needs emphasizing.
So, I mean, this is obviously a very interesting and quite an important story. Why do you feel it's not better known?
Well, I mean, it wasn't an immediate success. It didn't directly produce a huge result, simply because there wasn't, in the 16th century, there was not a northeast passage. But at the same time, its influence was vast. The other reason, I suppose, is that many of the voyages, many of the enterprises about which Richard Hakluyt wrote have been associated with the growth of the British Empire, with the early growth of empire. And there's certainly since the Second World War been quite a reaction against this. There's no doubt that many of the stories that Richard Hakluyt wrote about were once quite widely known. They were, his volumes were in the library of Protestant gentlemen up and down the land, up and down the empire. But at the same time, there's no doubt at all in my mind that it is a story that is unduly neglected. It does deserve to be better known. The instructions issued by Sebastian Cabot and the conduct of the voyage were very admirable. They urged that foreign nations be treated, as Cabot wrote, with gentleness and courtesy. They hoped that trade would lead towards a universal amity, as it was described. It sounds a little bit optimistic, but that is what was hoped. And its example, its importance, were very substantial. So if it has been neglected, which it has been neglected, it shouldn't be.
That was James Evans. Merchant Adventurers is out now, published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson. So that's almost all for this week. Do get in touch with your views on podcast@historyextra.com, and we'll do our best to read out some of your messages in future episodes. And you can also keep in touch with us on social media. We're on Twitter @historyextra, and of course we're on Facebook, facebook.com/historyextra. And do make sure to visit our website, historyextra.com, for all the latest history news, blogs, image galleries, quizzes and more. Plus don't forget, we've got our special Christmas sale going on now for digital editions on the iPad, the Kindle Fire and Google Play. Find us at the newsstand and the App Store to take advantage of this deal before it expires on the 1st of January. Next week, we'll be kicking off the new year with a broadcast of one of the lectures from our History Weekend, so do make sure you join us for that. This History Extra podcast was recorded in Bristol and on location in Suffolk and produced by Jack Fletcher.